Hello and welcome everyone. My name's Jake. I'm a JavaScript specialist here at Burnshire, and I'm joined by Mark Salvin, lead software engineer at Not on the High Street, bringing over 10 years experience working with mobile and web technologies across the stack. Mark will be walking through his team's testing journey from Enzyme into React testing library, and I will be running through any questions you guys have for Mark following the presentation. So please ask away in the Q&A box. Thanks, and over to you, Mark.
Cool. Thanks a lot for that, Jake. And hey, everyone, thanks for joining us today. So as Jake mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how you can write more valuable tests with React testing library. And specifically, I'm going to be kind of covering our journey from using Enzyme previously into React testing library. So just a few notes about me, pretty much what Jake said. I've been working with the industry for over kind of 10 years experience across mobile and web. I enjoy implementing well-architected, or I hope well-architected and pragmatic solutions to business challenges. I also enjoy the challenges of leadership and being a tech lead. And if you want to find out more about me, I've got links to my social and also a handful of blog posts over on my my personal website. So just to give you a bit of a backstory, really. So when I joined Not on the High Street earlier last year, the team had already begun working on re-platforming the site. And this included the underlying infrastructure, technology, tooling, standards and testing approach. And just give you a quick overview of that, we're now using Amazon Web Services, specifically ECS for running our Docker containers, Next.js for server rendering our React apps, and a Learner monorepo along with Yarn 2 for managing our dependencies, enabling us to keep all of our web apps in one place. And easily keep the packages up to date across the different web apps. So with some of this kind of foundation work in place, we soon began building a new web app for the product listings vertical slice. This is one of the most visited pages within our website. Just to dive a bit deeper into the kind of testing side of things. So initially we were unit testing our React components using Enzyme. And we were unit or really sort of integration testing our Redux toolkit slices. For anyone not familiar, Redux toolkit is a library that aims to remove the boilerplate or simplify the Redux boilerplate. We have a minimal set of UI flow tests using Test Cafe, which we opted for over Cypress because of this sort of cross-browser testing. Static analysis or accessibility static analysis using a tool called PyCI. Visual regression testing using PerCIO, although this is still a work in progress. And web performance testing using Lighthouse for synthetic performance tests and Datadog for our run testing. Also worth mentioning that we're using TypeScript, and this helps to ensure type safety, and we use it for our prop validation as well, and also ESLinting to provide us with linting. So if we drill down now into the sort of the unit test or the UI testing side of things, we did experience, or we were finding that we're experiencing a number of pain points with Enzyme. Firstly, we were finding that our Enzyme tests were time-consuming to write, and we realized that we were often testing the implementation details. The tests at times became arguably overly complex, and we did find quite a high overlap in coverage. And one thing that we began to notice is that we often weren't capturing some of the integration bugs between various components because of kind of testing and isolation, really. And this is despite the high test coverage that we did have. Our tests often also needed reworking after refactors. At this point, we began to ask the question, are our tests really providing us with confidence or simply a false sense of security? And given that they were taking quite a bit of time to write, we really started to ask as well, are they providing a sufficient return on that investment of time? This kind of takes us back really to the sort of fundamental question of why do we test? And I imagine different people might give you a slightly different flavor of this answer, but essentially we're looking to provide confidence that our app works correctly. And this includes both the user journeys and some of the sort of key business logic. Automated tests help protect us against regressions, and they can also really help as a kind of workflow enhancement that simplifies refactors and adding enhancements when we're able to very quickly run a test suite following any changes that we make. Other things to consider with writing tests, it is a trade-off between velocity and quality. But with a good balance, tests enable us to move faster, particularly later in the project lifecycle. But without a good balance, we can drift towards either a long manual testing process with regular firefighting or an overly burdensome automated testing process, which stifles or can stifle innovation. So we ended up getting together as a team and kind of discussing both the pain points along with what really our sort of aspirations were for our tests. We looked at the tools and libraries that we were using. We looked at some of the things that were available or being used widely within the industry. And this kind of led us back to React testing library, which is something that some of us did have experience with from before or from things that we've done outside of work as well. So for those of you unfamiliar, React testing library states the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And this is quite a stark contrast to the sort of enzyme testing approach where you're looking to really test things in isolation and often resorting to heavy use of mocking. So this is something that was discussed within the team and ended up being agreed upon. And from this point, what we did is we wanted to really make sure everyone within the team was really engaged with this journey. So everyone within the team paired up. We essentially went away and performed some spikes where we looked to test some functions, or rather some components within our app, and some of the more complex components. We then regrouped as a team to discuss the spikes, discuss any learnings that we had, some of the difficulties, some of the things we liked, some of the things we disliked, and compare approaches. On the back of this, we were able to define our project standards that we look to follow from that point onwards. We defined some complex use cases that we kind of wanted to go away and to work on first. And we then wrote a reference implementation. And it was during this reference implementation that we also created a lightweight suite of helpers. And this is in line with the React testing library recommendations. And we really encouraged within the team as well that everyone would really actively review that reference implementation. And rather than rush it through, we were really keen that everyone was, as I said, very much engaged within how we were going to use this tool going forward. So just to give you a bit of a before and after. So taking a test here for a load more button. And so we do have, like on our listings page, the ability to kind of keep loading further content rather than paginating through. And you can see what we have here is quite a sort of typical test setup. So we're using a describe block. We have some initial state that we're setting up that we're sort of sharing between tests. And in this before all hook, we're shallow rendering the button. For anyone unfamiliar, shallow rendering is a way to render your component in isolation and avoid rendering out the child DOM. It also it doesn't create some of the React lifecycle methods as well. So it's the generally followed and recommended approach within Enzyme. And then we have these very granular tests following that. We're really testing very implementation detail specific things. So the intent is good, but it is very implementation detailed oriented. Moving on to kind of an example of what a test began to look like with React testing libraries. So you can see here that first of all, the tests have less sort of, they're a bit simpler, but also they're more end user focused. So with say this second test, you know, we're checking something that the end user actually sees. So we have this loading spinner and it essentially goes through the set of transitions as we would expect. So we kind of render it out, we check some things, re-render it, check some things, re-render again. So this was sort of where we got to initially, and what were some of our key learnings and decisions that we made as a team. So firstly, we agreed to avoid testing the very simplest of components, so things like buttons and headings. We also agreed to avoid testing too high up where possible at the page level, for example. And there is a balance here because the higher up you test, the more your tests resemble the end user experience, which is a good thing. And it's something that you know, you'll see mentioned a lot within the React testing library docs. On the flip side, the higher you test, the more test setup you require, the more likely you are to start mocking framework and routing functionality, the more brittle your test can become, and the less specific your failed tests can become. So there's kind of a middle ground that we felt we wanted to reach. Another thing that we agreed on was we wanted to focus on testing the end user functionality over the implementation details. It's worth mentioning here that accessibility attributes and functionality is something that should be considered part of the end user functionality, as for less abled users, they may be accessing the website on a screen reader, and therefore things like your accessibility attributes, they are actually directly going to impact their experience. And we also agreed that we would look to leverage code coverage tools. So we're using NYC, which is kind of powered by Istanbul. So look to leverage those to identify any gaps in our testing. And at that point, we're able to then kind of triage those gaps and make a decision about, you know, should this component be covered by a higher up level component? Or actually, is this just a very trivial component? There's not really anything to test other than implementation details, such as kind of mapping props. Well, we've got our TypeScript, we've got our linting, we don't really need that or get much value from that. So maybe we'll just actually remove that from our coverage. Here's a further example. So here we have the filter component that we built, and on the small screen, so you have a sort of responsive layout. And looking at these tests that we have, you'll see again that they're very focused on the end user experience. So initially the filter shouldn't display, then the correct title should be displayed when the modal is open. And you'll see here that we're setting up the store. We are dispatching a Redux action. The reason we made this choice was because whilst we're testing the filter component, actually the button that opens and closes it, or opens it rather, is outside of it. And we wanted to avoid, like I said, testing at that kind of page level. So we did need to do a few things like this. So dispatch a Redux action, then the assertions. You'll see things like we're checking the role is correct. For taking the third test, for example, we're checking the role is correct. We're checking the label text, things that can be thought of as part of the actual end user experience. Some of the further decisions that we made as a team. Firstly, we agreed we wanted to avoid nesting tests. This is something that introduces implicit context, and thus it can increase the cognitive load of actually reasoning about your tests, even though they may appear simple at first. We also found that this was really creating a lot of rebase and merge headaches for us, and this was something that we were keen to move away from. Another thing, and you'll kind of see this recommended by React Testing Library, but we wanted to avoid hasty abstractions within our tests. So while any abstractions can dry up your tests, they can introduce errors and increase the complexity of your tests. And we wanted to avoid getting into a position where with that increasing complexity, you almost end up, or you can end up needing tests for your tests. So that's something that we want to stay away from. And here we sort of got preferred duplication over the wrong abstraction and optimize for change first. It's worth saying that abstractions are still necessary in some instances, and so it's not something that we avoid as like a blanket rule. Write fewer, longer tests. This better lends itself to avoiding shared variables and state between tests, making the tests easier to follow. It also leads to less boilerplate, and we're kind of following this arrange, act assert pattern. So on the back of some of these further decisions, here's another before and after. So again, we're taking a filter menu component this time. You'll see we have this nesting, we have these shorter tests and increased abstractions. Take a look at this after one. Again, it's flat, have these longer tests, fewer abstractions. And as I kind of mentioned, we're really focusing here on end user experience. That's kind of a bit of an introduction to React Testing Library, but from this point, we then look to introduce further tooling into our setup via a library called mock service worker. The reason for this, initially we were using, or we were mocking the Redux store, but we found that this led to an often complex setup with tight coupling with the store architecture. We were concerned that this could cause refactor headaches and decrease confidence in the tests in the future, because you're further abstracting the test setup from the actual architecture. For those of you who aren't familiar, mock service worker mocks both client and server API calls at the network level using a consistent API. And this is useful because many mocking packages work for either client or the server, but not for both. So what we did is we created a mock service worker proof of concept. And via this, we were able to reduce the setup code, which was further supported by using this builder pattern, which I'll kind of demonstrate shortly. We were able to remove that tight coupling with the store architecture, and we were able to, or we felt that we had increased confidence in that end-to-end integration, because, well, you have something that is nearer to that end-to-end integration that you're testing. And all this is while still benefiting from a far quicker test suite than a traditional UI testing library such as Cypress or Test Cafe. With mock service worker, we were able to enhance our workflow with API mocks that provide only the necessary data for components under test. And this enables us to render and test the components locally in isolation, which is really handy because this enables local development when the API goes down, and can also simplify both development and testing of UX edge cases where the API response might be difficult to elicit organically. And here's an example using mock service workers. So here we're taking a filter menu component again. And you'll see that we have a few things here. So kind of similar to previously, we are rendering out the filter menu container and passing in a store, but the way that we're building that store is different to what I demonstrated previously. So rather than actually setting up the Redux store for that explicitly, we're instead dispatching an action to call the API in the same way that our app actually would when populating the listings page. So near the top, you see this this request product method call. This is calling backend API, and then the app itself actually takes care of populating all of the state, and that's what really decouples us from the store architecture. You see we have this before all and the after all hook. That's where we're setting up the mock service worker server and where we're tearing it down at the end of our test. And just again, looking at the actual test itself, we have a user event, so we're clicking on something and we're kind of testing based on text that we can see on the screen. Do things look the way or indicative of the type of user experience that we would expect? Just going a bit further into that, so what we have or what our kind of architecture for this is, we have this mocks folder that we keep with our components. Within that, we have a handlers file, server file, and a universal file. So the server file, this is what's setting up the mock service worker using that setup server method. We're passing our handlers. The universal file, this is something that is enabling us to actually do the in-browser local development as well. And then the handlers file, you see it's pretty simple here. We're defining our endpoints, or we actually just have one endpoint in this instance. And we're defining the JSON payload that endpoint should come back with. And this is where we're actually leveraging that builder pattern that I mentioned previously. And that's really nice. So we find it really powerful because rather than having to have the entire JSON response, which might be quite long, it might contain a lot of data that isn't necessarily pertinent to your test, but is needed just to get it to actually to work. With this, we're able to provide sort of sensible defaults within that builder for the API response, and just define the things that are pertinent to that test. And it enables you, when you go into this mock, to really quickly be able to see the data that is relevant to this test, and then it kind of helps inform you as to, I guess, what you would expect the output to be if you're debugging that test, or if you're making any changes to it in future. So what we've done since then, this is something that we have been using within the team for several months now. And we've gone on to, so we wanted to avoid kind of a big bang migration and instead take a more organic approach. So what we did is we did remove some of the low value tests. That was something that was quite quick to do. We then began migrating enzyme tests piecemeal to React testing library alongside mock service workers. So anytime we're sort of touching a component or a set of components, we really use that as an opportunity to move the tests over to this new testing approach. We also applied the same approach to our analytics testing, and we found this to be really powerful. Again, because by taking this approach, we were able to provide quite a lot of confidence that data was being passed all the way through from the API into the correct tracking event for our kind of analytics, without having to spin up something like a test cafe or a Cypress test that would be a lot more cumbersome, but still having quite a representative feel of that architecture. Are we still enjoying it? Or we're finding that we're spending less time writing tests, but we also feel an increased level of confidence in our tests as a team. So we feel that with increased confidence that the actual user functionality works, as opposed to just the components are written in the way that we wrote the components. We feel that there is fewer UI behavioral defects and regressions, and tests feel easier to reason about and easier to change with confidence. We've moved away from those rebase and those merge headaches within our tests I mentioned previously, and that's no longer really a big thing for us, or really a thing at all. And we find that refactoring less commonly will break our tests as well. So overall, we are enjoying using it. And that's it for this talk. So in this talk, we've kind of covered our journey from Enzyme to React Testing Library, along with some of those decisions that we made. I hope you have found it interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Great, thanks for that, Mark. That was great. Yeah, so let's fire away with a few questions. We've got a few come in. So first up, why longer tests? If they fail early, you lose a bunch of asserts and the rest of the long test.
Yeah, so a few reasons for using longer tests, outside of the fact that it is what's kind of encouraged by the React Testing Library philosophy, but essentially by using longer tests, it can lead to like less mocking of setup state and bringing your tests nearer to what the end user experiences. It does make them a bit less specific, but it is nearer to the end user journey that they're actually going to have with your app. It also means that you have less boilerplate, essentially, as well.
And do you have any more details on accessibility testing with this?
Yeah, so I wouldn't see React Testing Library as your only thing or your only tool that you'd use for accessibility testing, but some of the things we can do is you have selectors that are looking for accessibility attributes within the HTML markup. So that's kind of the primary thing that we're doing with it.
Yeah. So you mentioned not testing Atom-style components, buttons, etc. How do you avoid missing testing defined business logic held in these components, e.g. a validation in an input or how an error state displays in the button?
Yeah, so I guess it comes down partly to the complexity of that component. If your button is a very complex atom with a lot of business logic within there, then maybe that is something that you're going to want to put a test around. What you might also find, though, is that some of that, maybe one thing I should have mentioned was that we look to make our components as simple as possible by, where possible, extracting the business logic outside of the component and then having a unit test around that business component, so that the atom itself is really just kind of mapping props. Maybe something's going through a function call, but that's tested separately.
Great. So next one up. With MSW, how do you avoid your responses stubs becoming stale against API changes?
Yeah, good question. So obviously, if your API is changing very often, that could become a challenge. I suggest firstly there that you try to follow things like the open close principles of your APIs and try to avoid changing the sort of shape of them often. But one way that we were sort of protected against that is by following this builder pattern. So if there is a change to the API structure, then rather than having to go through all of the mocks and update all of the JSON responses, instead we can just update that builder, and that actually kind of abstracts away that API response structure.
Right. Don't you find longer tests harder to understand and describe? Testing multiple states, things into one test means it's harder for someone to look at it and understand the component and test at a glance.
Yeah, an interesting question. I guess to some degree it's probably going to be a little bit subjective, but I think your tests are easier to understand when they more closely resemble the user experience, or when you can sort of visualize it. So I wouldn't advocate your test become extremely long, but basic journeys of click this button, click this, and then click this, and just check these 3 things. That's quite easy for me to visualize and imagine, because it's how I would use the app. And we've not really found that that's been an issue or a challenge.
Great. So do you do cross-browser and cross-platforming testing?
We do, yes. So that's something that we use Test Cafe alongside Browser Stack for. Yeah,
and last one, do Not on the High Street have any mobile native apps to test as well?
Yes, yeah, we do.
Great. Well, so yeah, thank you all again for joining us, and a massive thank you to Mark for presenting today. Any sort of further questions, we'll make sure you get that answered. We're always keen to hear back from our tech community. So if you've got a talk that you're keen to present, just like Mark, or if there's any other topics that you'd love to hear about, please let us know via myself or our marketing team, Becca and Beth. Yeah, just thanks everyone again, and thanks Mark, that was great, and have a great day. Thanks.